kind of curious, you're speaking against kind of an Orientalist, culturalist, religious interpretation of why that problem of harassment is there. But I'm interested about the relationship you see between the kind of state policies or the state practices and also the emergence of how harassment becomes a problem. Like, is it just sort of reflective? Are the practices by the state reflective of the larger problem, or are they productive of that problem? I'm thinking of Indonesia, where obviously I study, and it's Muslim, 90% Muslim. There was a very secular-oriented military authoritarian regime there, 30 years. Very patriarchal, using sexualized violence. You had the rape of the Chinese in 1998 and so on. But they also have a woman president, right? Like 5 years later, which is kind of stunning. And I was just wondering, like, the way in which you see that relationship. Like, what are the particularities about Egypt? What are the particularities sort of about the Middle East? Or is it just kind of a globalized problem?
So I guess maybe a partial answer to your question is to sort of historicize like how it sort of became this sort of epidemic, right? And people start thinking about it as an epidemic. And part of that has to do with, I think, right around like mid-2000s, there wasn't as much of a kind of female presence in the street and a lot of like trade union protests or anti-government protests. And then the men were just, being beaten and shot. So a tactic that kind of women had sort of developed together was that they would be on the front lines because these security forces wouldn't do anything to them, And they were pious and they were wearing hijab, and they stood as this kind of barrier between these people who were protesting and the military. And so the military ended up basically institutionalizing harassment and violence against women as a way to get them off the street again, thinking if they roughed them up a little bit that they would just go back home. So that didn't really happen, but you can kind of see a shift in how that's become more acceptable, but also as a kind of a tool of intimidation, a tool of political intimidation that we saw happening quite a bit during the demonstrations. Now, I mean, I think people get sexually harassed during all kinds of political demonstrations, so I don't think there's anything specific about Egypt than, St. Patty's Day parade in New York City, right? So, I mean, I'm not trying to make those kinds of distinctions, but I am trying to say that talking about it as a cultural problem has broader violent implications, than just thinking about sexual harassment, right? In terms of kind of how we think about the Middle East, how we think about going to war with the Middle East. Yes.
Thanks for the talk. That was super interesting. I'm wondering how much the project is imagined to contribute to a greater global, perhaps, awareness of sexual violence. And I guess I'm thinking about, previous situations like the Bosnian War and even the war in Darfur, and perhaps even the oppressions in Burma, Myanmar. So those were, in particular Bosnia, I think there was a tremendous amount of sexual violence, and feminists were trying as hard as they could to bring back awareness to outside of the country, to the U.S. And I think that they were only partially successful until eventually at the end it became more, when the U.S. got involved, it became more well-known. So I was just wondering that, are they imagined, when the women who are doing that, are they imagining this as a way of increasing awareness that this is happening to them in their space?
I think it's a way, I don't know if they think that people don't know that it's happening. I mean, the way that they talk about it, it's a way to give women a kind of outlet. So they've talked about how, like, you're feeling harassed and something happens to you and you kind of have nowhere to go or nowhere to talk to. Just putting that message in a phone can give you a kind of feeling of relief, or that you did something about it, right? I do think it probably part of an awareness campaign as well. But I also see it as kind of punitive a little bit, especially when I would kind of go through these reports and I would see pictures uploaded of, you know, young men who are saying things or whatever, like the image from the men in the cars from a report. You know, when I see stuff like that, I wonder about, like, you know, that picture is going to be online forever. And so, I mean, I know they like messed up, but like, what do we think about rehabilitating harassers? Like, there's no language about that in any of this, any of these reports. It really seems very punitive. So, you know, we have to live with each other, right? So, like, is this the best way to do that? I don't know. You know, I'm skeptical if the map is really the way to do that. I think, yeah. Yes.
Sorry, you keep mentioning the individual part, and I'm interested in kind of the way that the map represents the data is kind of different from the kind of Foucauldian way of surveillance, which will discipline or individualize. So I'm kind of curious what it is. I mean, what you've just said is a pretty good example about how it's managing individuals differently by presenting them and recirculating their images forever without necessarily disciplining them or trying to get them to change. But I couldn't help also look at that map and think it kind of shows where you would go if you wanted to commit sexual violence and get away with it. Right? You'd either go where the red dot isn't, and then you won't be reported, or go where the red dot is, and there's so many incidents.
Find friends who are doing it too.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, the map is not just mapping where harassment is happening, but also where potentially it can happen.
Or where the state is very active.
Yeah.
I mean, that was something that I had suggested. Like, maybe they said, I mean, in other research, I read blogs and things, and there was a story about a woman who was basically shut in and locked in her house because she had been blogging like anti-government sentiment, and these men, there's like 5 or 6 of them who she knew were about to were just hanging around outside of her house, and she was afraid to leave. So, you know, what could she do? Well, if she didn't have that idea, she could text an SMS report and then like send something about harassment, and it would present a different picture about what was really happening. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure if that answers the Foucault part.
I'm just curious, how is it managing individuals differently than observing people in the panopticon, whatever, manages their... I
mean, you know, again, maybe a partial answer to that would be how communications campaigns are deployed, right? They're looking at that particular spot on a map, and then they're going out there and they're kind of forcing conversations with people. They're forcing them to sign documents. Sometimes they can't read those documents. They're telling shopkeepers that, you know, basically if you don't put a harassment sticker in your window, you should be either shamed into doing that, or we may encourage people not to go do business at your store, right? So these are kind of maybe more the same, maybe kind of the Foucauldian sort of policing techniques that you're talking about. But a lot of that is contingent on how the data is organized, right, through this idea of individuals, like reducing these experiences to kind of quantitative index that can then be used to act upon real space.
Any final questions?
I wonder if, you know, Bjorn Weissman's response to politics of verticalization, forensics, right?
Yeah.
Can help not only critique, but also think of different kinds of alternatives, different kinds of ways of investigating, right, and creating forums, instead of what seems like a way to help security implement a certain kind of regime of, you know, violence against men, and even seems like a skipping of certain kinds of procedures, right?
Yeah. I use E.L. Weissman a lot in this piece, particularly for thinking about kind of how they see their territory as volumetric as opposed to just sort of a two-dimensional map space. Mm-hmm. And then that has to do with kind of the materiality of the assemblages that the map has to use in order to present this kind of two-dimensional picture, right? Satellites in the sky, all the way kind of right down to a smartphone. But yeah, he was very influential for me for thinking about that. Yeah, space is volumetric.
Well, thank you very
Okay.
much for your time.
Thank you.